Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Again, for the second time, it's indeed an honor and pleasure for me to welcome you all to our second RC07 webinar on the construction of sexual and reproductive justice in South Africa, post-apartheid, presented by our distinguished speaker, Marion Stevens from Stellenbosch, South Africa University. Before I give the floor to Dr. Amanda to introduce our speaker, allow me to share with you a brief introduction of who we are. So our committee, the Research Committee on Women, Politics and Developing Nations, RC07, was created as a study group in 1988 by the International Political Association, and became a full-fledged research committee in 1992. In December 27, the RC's name was changed to Women and Politics in the Global South, and we embrace like multiple research topics and areas undertaken by political scientists from all over the world. So the RCO also addresses the persistent issues, challenges and questions related to the presence and experiences on women and politics in the political sphere. Some topics have also historically have been of an interest to the committee, which includes women, depths and structural adjustment, women and environment, women in the democratization, women leadership in economic institutions, and women's rights. To mirror real-world women politics, we invite all researchers interested in gender politics in all spheres to submit, their pitches for presentations in either English, French, Arabic, or Spanish. Please follow us on Twitter. I'm just going to share the link on the message box. And without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Dr. Amanda to introduce our distinguished speaker, Marion Stevens.
Thanks, Yasmin, and hello to everyone who's attending today. And let me say, I am so pleased that RC07 now has the webinar series. I was the chair of RC07 at one point, but we didn't have a webinar series, so it's really great that we are highlighting the work that women political scientists do. And even if you're not a political scientist, you're most welcome to present. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Marion Stevens today to do the seminar. And let me congratulate her because she has just received her Ph.D. under my supervision. And so Marion, congratulations, and I'm very proud of you. Marion has the distinction that she has worked her entire career in this sector of reproductive rights. She was the founder, member, and director of the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition, and also the founding member of She, a Transgender Coalition. She works not only on the national level in South Africa, where she's worked with policymakers, lawmakers, and where she has written many of the drafts of laws that we have in South Africa, some of them nicely implemented and others not so well implemented. But she also works on the transnational and international level with UN Women and with Doctors Without Borders. So Marion has a lifetime of experience doing this work, and she has the historical memory of what happened under apartheid, but what has also happened post-apartheid, and this is what she's going to talk to us about today. Thanks, Marion.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks for this opportunity to present. I'm just paging down. There we go. So I'm going to be presenting on my PhD research, a policy analysis from population control to the construction of sexual and reproductive health post-apartheid, 1990, from 1994 to 2021. And I'm using Carol Bucky's framework mainly a policy analysis framework, what is the problem represented to be? So it looks at how policy is being constructed, constituted as problematic, and how this has led to reproductive justice or lack of it. And it's informed by qualitative, constructionist, interpretive orientations. And what I do is I review some of the documents that I have been involved with since 1994, the population policy, the adolescent sexual and reproductive health strategy framework, different versions of our contraception guidelines, the Choice and Termination of Pregnancy Act, and the abortion clinical guidelines. So I review these documents, but I also complemented this with about 21 interviews with different decision makers, researchers, and implementers. Okay. So looking at our history, we have an immense legacy in South Africa of colonization, history of slavery, and being home to refugees. Our legacy is horrific. Sexuality was policed through the Immorality Act, which forbade sexual relations between Black and white persons. Land, livelihoods, and businesses were expropriated at a whim. And apartheid instrumentalized population through control through the policing of Black bodies. Women were policed, contraception was restricted, women were dismissed from work if they were pregnant, and in some instances could only access contraception if they were married in the private sector. There was a huge investment in public sector family planning clinics for Africans, and the apartheid military researched vaccines to limit and control fertility. We lived in a population engineering industrial complex. Project Coast was argued to be genocidal. I'm not even touching on counter-normative sexual orientations and gender identities, and it goes without saying these were marginalized. Population control and engineering of families is deeply personal, as these are my maternal great-grandparents. Rachel was a Jewish immigrant from East Europe who married my entrepreneurial great-grandfather, Frederick, who had a transport bus company. Their land and businesses were expropriated. Their marriage was viewed as illegal and immoral, and any inheritance was seized by the master of the court. My family split and endured enormous systemic violence. My aunts and cousins endured terrible sexual violence, forced sterilization, and mental ill health. My grandmother got my mother to pass as white. But I'm not alone. This is the experience of many South Africans, and I stand on their shoulders. So post-1994, we developed a paper tiger, a substantial paper tiger of reformed law and policy, something on the outside that looks very powerful, but perhaps in reality quite ineffectual. Our population policy in 1998, stemming from the National Population Unit, sought to name and redress population engineering of the population era, and has a similar, perhaps further reaching ideas than the International Conference on Population Development held in Cairo in 1994. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights addresses a range of important clauses, including the Equality Clause, the right to reproductive health, bodily autonomy, to be free from discrimination in relation to gender and sexual orientation. Our Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act has been viewed as a very progressive piece alongside the laws in Tunisia and Ethiopia on the continent, liberalizing our abortion services and separating out from the Sterilization Act. Our Department of International Relations has negotiated on an international platform some of these issues, being informed by the progressive legal provisions, although sometimes rather inconsistently. Nevertheless, the basis has been the understanding of the radical social determinants of health, the very context that enables or disenables. And we acknowledge the overlapping and multiple oppressions that make up this context. There are no single issues. All of these laws, in many ways, stem from our history and legacy of inequalities. So I think it's important to reflect back, and I think my colleague Imelda is on the call. Imelda is the person in the pink book here, some 30 years ago, maybe it's a little bit long. Yeah, no, I don't know, 1994. But I think Kosi Baba might also be on the call with Rachel, who also participated in this conference. But women's organizing for sexual and reproductive health in South Africa is important to note historically. Civil society was organized, and I was the conference coordinator for the 1994 Women's Health Policy Conference. It was a year-long national and provincial consultation process involving over 4,500 women. 13 different policies were developed, from abortion to contraception to violence against women, gender-based violence, STIs, STDs and HIV, lesbian health issues, occupational health, cancers, teenage pregnancy, maternal neonatal care, mental health, aging, training of health providers. And 450 women eventually came to the conference and approved these policies. And the policy process enabled significant political consciousness raising during that time, and seeded groups like the Reproductive Rights Alliance, the National Network on Violence Against Women, and strengthened organizations like the National Coalition for Gay and Lesbian Equality. And even conversations in 1994 started about sexual pleasure. On the last day, planning was held with newly formed strategic management teams in the provinces to look at planning for implementation. And the point here is that civil society was organized in 94, and they worked in partnership with government. So a key challenge in the past 25 years has been HIV and AIDS, with the response unfortunately being a single lens, a vertical program. And due to the burden of disease, treatment became a central focus. And it's important to note that women have been bearing the brunt of the epidemic, where with 60% of all infections in the region affecting women. One of the gaps and neglected areas has been fertility planning for HIV positive women, with prevention of child transmission or prevention of mother to child transmission only focusing on the outcome of a healthy infant as opposed to what a woman might want. So PMTCT focal point 2, the prevention of unintended pregnancies, never programmed for enabling contraception options or abortion. A woman who found out that they were pregnant and HIV positive on the same day would go into a queue to enable her pregnancy and to treatment. Having an abortion was not really on the table, and many women have chosen illegal or informal providers to address these options. The US has been the largest donor of health systems, public and private services in South Africa. And in many ways, we have been recolonized by their puritanical cultures and restrictive funding conditions, noting limitations on work in relation to abortion, sex work, and queer health. The women's movement itself lost many cadres to the HIV movement, and the HIV the movement itself was fraught and a difficult space for organizing feminists. HIV divided the women's movement, and some were co-opted and silenced. In the fear and stigma of HIV programming, sexual and reproductive health emerged as a separate silo. And a clear example of this is the programming around medical male circumcision, And women were arguing that, well, this is not really very beneficial to us. And it made negotiating condom use very difficult for women, as men felt a level of protection. And the evidence for these studies was complex, as it was not a longer, over longitudinal time. It was only for 6 months after the circumcision. So women's sexual and reproductive health was not considered here. So unfortunately, with HIV programming, donors have determined most of the programming. The gag rule, the Mexico gag rule, which many of you will be familiar with around programming, was implemented from Reagan and has danced between Republicans and donors after Bush reimposed it. Sexual and reproductive health commitments and programming has fallen by the wayside. And even in the Obama years, there's been limited traction. In the context of austerity, there's no ring-fence sexual and reproductive health budget. But with flipping the topic of the world, there's also been a dominance of private foundations with the Gates Foundation and the Buffin Foundation. And there's been self-gagging and really weak stewardship by government actors. We've not had ministers of health speak out about abortion and provide leadership. And the gap has enabled the creep and hegemony of American international NGOs in this space, in that the majority of work taking place here is led by international NGOs. And this is pretty much a neo-colonial practice. There's been no investment in local movement building. In fact, the work and research tends to be rather extractive. And the kind of work has been orientated to a very particular style of US influencer, social media, astroturf organizing, and consultants paying for rented voices. In many instances, there are perhaps corrupt practices, with US consultancies being paid large numbers to do the work that could have been done by local groups. And this takes place when the right wing continues to flourish and emerge, and interestingly take on the language of colonization in relation to sexual and reproductive health, and seeing those as a Western and a Northern imposition. So in looking at contraception, this has been an area of reform where there have been different iterations of our guidelines. And it's important and illustrative to note that we're moving away from the language of family planning to use contraception. Not all persons who use contraception are planning families. Adolescents generally are not planning families, and many of you are aware that we use contraception to treat conditions such as endometriosis or polycystic ovarian syndrome or for acne. Some trans men are using it for gender affirming care and use it without given clinical guidelines, given the absence of trans affirming care. The main method that's used in South Africa is Depo-Provera, DMPA, and it remains around 60–65%. This method, you will know, was initially developed to treat endometrial cancer. Policies have been revised to increase method mix and to improve counseling. And we have modern methods such as the ring and the patch, but these have not been available in the public sector. Counseling has been well researched, and in the implementation processes, but the practice has essentially been described as coercive with little consultation, and some theorizing and describing this as reproductive violence. Our measurement of contraception is outdated and heteronormative. We use the number of contraceptive products distributed divided by a ratio of heterosexual couples. The new 2014 guidelines were launched and reviewed, and was done so over concern of HIV acquisition from DMPA. And unfortunately, the launch was done with the emphasis of a single contraception option, the Implanon. And in first year, 1 million of these devices were inserted. It was a donor-driven process with very poor outcomes. Health workers were not equipped to remove these. And there were many women that complained of side effects. because the contraindications were not well understood then. It should not be taken by people who are on TB drugs, and we have serious TB epidemic in South Africa. Similarly, people who are epileptic or women who have large body mass index. And we're only starting to see training of health providers for the remains in the realm of paternal prevention, to prevent as opposed to autonomy, which is disappointing. Each year we have seen the increase of Depo-Provera, and you can see this from our district health barometer. The ECHO trial suggests that one should continue with Depo-Provera. However, there's been concern and resistance about this decision. It's believed that the ECHO trial that was trying to look at the difference between HIV and acquisition between Depo-Provera, the gel implant, or the copper IUD, basically concluded that none was worse than the other. There was generally a high transmission rate. But the 2019 guidelines continued with Depo-Provera as usual. And one of my key informants said it's like the language that's used, it's to klaba, to inject. It's like the language that we use. We don't talk about toothpaste, we talk about Colgate. So in many ways, the language of contraception is the injection. And at the same time, during COVID, we had stockouts of contraception. And this has been evidenced still by the complexity of sensational adolescent reporting on teenagers. One of the issues is that Depo-Provera is now being repackaged as a self-injection injection called the Sayana Press. And the current guidelines has a large emphasis on adolescents in working towards a preventative strategy. It does not focus on sexual health or link with contraception, comprehensive sexuality education. The recent guidelines also remove the sections on migrants and sex workers. So the question remains, how do we determine our own options in South Africa around contraception when there's clearly a footprint of donor interference and very little autonomy over our public fiscus in relation to modern methods? Just lost page down. So in many ways, we've seen this increase of Depo-Provera over the past years. And the Depo-Provera is just not popular. We've started to see it almost being theorized and spoken of as injectable development. And at the same time, we see that within abortion, only 7% of facilities are operational. We've also see on the top left here, individualistic campaigns by the Department of Health directed around the adolescent panic around teenage pregnancy. They essentially responsibilizing individual girls as opposed to looking at the contextual and interlinked factors that would enable young schoolgirls to engage with their books before babies. And it's also racialized, whether all of these have been Black girl power. And it links to some of the tropes around blaming Black bodies on the climate crisis as well. What we've started to see as well has been the private sector taking space here and selling choice and exclusive care and outsourcing public care, using the language of reproductive justice. Here, you are seeing a service which is like MS Plus, Marie Stopes Plus, and you essentially pay for your post-procedure snack and tea. You're also seeing international NGOs like IPAS investing in training private providers. So here they're looking at training providers in only long-acting reversible contraceptives like the implant, and you have Marie Stopes having a promotion, a sale of abortions on the same day. So this leads to some of my thinking and drawing on the ideas of Bhatia around populationism. So no longer talking about population control, but looking at different ways of talking of populationism, looking at demopopulation, geopopulation, and biopopulation. In South Africa, Amrita Pandi has looked at some of the complexities of biopopulationism. We've also seen, it's also quite clear that the emphasis of the Sayana Press could be argued to be biopopulationism, where you're seeing a new method being repackaged for women, which is essentially unsafe. And these areas intellect with each other and work in tandem. Kathy Albertine has also theorized around reproductive rights and climate justice, and the complexity of how we're still seeing language of blaming individuals, and in particular young Black girls, on the climate crisis. I'm going to now include some of the reflections that some of my key informants had when talking about population control. So, do you mean population control when they're thinking about contraception? I think people often do. I think that. I ask, say more, and they continued. People don't really articulate it in that way, but I think there's a subtleness in the way around it comes in, right? I mean, if you look at, you know who we worry about, whether they are having kids or not. It's really the poor folks, right? We worry more about the poor folks having kids than rich folks, because the assumption is, well, rich folks can afford having these kids, but poor folks can't, and therefore shouldn't be. And therefore, we should increase access to contraceptives to these poor folks. So I think it's becoming a very subliminal thing now, rather, you know. So quite clearly, the disconnect between and juxtapositioning between thinking and language around population control and contraception. Some decision makers started to talk about the leadership. Within the ANC itself, it's like many of the fundamental values and principles that revolve around population manners are just not well understood or well known or understood or appreciated by many people in leadership positions, particularly outside of the center. And then obviously you venture into things like migration and so on. And even you have ministers saying things like, and gasped with talking about some of the utterances with some of our recent ministers around teenage pregnancies and migration. About population control, I think about the distribution of contraceptives. I have my reservations about that to say, but in terms of the language around different aspects of colonialism, 100% I agree. It's the terminology that has changed, but the idea is still the same. So essentially suggesting that population control persists. I want to just remind us of Margaret Sanger and her relationship with Marie Stopes. who was essentially extraordinarily racist in their work around the provision of contraceptives, clearly looking at trying to control women, in particular poor women and Black women. And this is one of my interviews where a provider was talking about the absence of training. I'm not going to read it all, but essentially what this person is talking about is how we've got a public-private partnership with Marion Stevens, and we're all outsourcing care, and it's very confusing for women because they go to the clinic and then they're told to go to Marion Stevens. And Marion Stevens is getting a large budget from the Department of Health, as opposed to the public sector being supported in organizing the health system to provide care. And this is a picture of students at UCT, where and what I'm trying to show here is that health workers actually want to be trained to be providers in sexual and reproductive health. But this was a protest at a meeting where the conservative group was essentially explaining to providers how they could get out of providing care and object to services. So when they were graduating, they were being taken through a process of how they could object to care, or the other language would be to become conscientious objectors. And this was a old professor of anatomy who's been very well known to be organizing and to limit health providers being able to become providers of sexual reproductive health care. So my last slide is that I want to talk about a director of an international NGO who really was incredibly disillusioned by her work. I was naive when I joined. I ideologically believed in women's autonomy, and this was the driving force around this work. But the cultural dynamic was one of control and funder-driven. It was all about statistics. How many uterine evacuations performed, how many people walked out with long-acting contraception. While there was good quality work, at the end of the day, it was all about numbers. The donor, known as the large anonymous donor, was making an enormous investment. This was where I became undone. I was split internally because politically it was evident to me that this was not about autonomy. This was not about women's self-choice or rights. This was about population culture. In the end, it was about figures. We were ticking boxes in the most technical way and devoid of a sense of healthcare, and struggling in a system collapsing all around us. And I've got 2 more slides. Another provider was saying, so what would you like to see as an outcome? Increased reproductive justice initiatives or whatever? Is it a decrease in teenage pregnancy? You know, what would it be? How would you measure it? And so here, a lot of numbers, indicators juxtaposed with not addressing the social and structural conditions, and an obsession with adolescents and teenage pregnancies. So my concluding thought is that we have a construction of sexual and reproductive health where poor service delivery remains, with contested power relations and a fraught constructed ideological environment. Population control, populationism, is our context informed by inequitable services. The environment is informed by competing and invested stakeholders, not always ideologically aligned. International donors inform implementation and research. They're interwoven, connected, and juxtaposing dominant and marginalized framings, along with silences in sexual and reproductive health. The incoherence masks regressive forms of contemporary population control and population remains with moral judgments of girls and adolescents and blaming them for social and environmental ills. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And my sincere appreciation goes to you, Dr. Marion, for this very valuable, informative presentation on this very important topic. Now I'm actually leaving Dr. Amanda if she has anything to say, and then we open the floor to any question, remarks, additions to this great presentation.
Yes, let me just switch on my. Yes, thank you, Marion. I think you did a comprehensive review there of what you had in your dissertation, but also in the how Bucky shows us that you need to problematize every type of policy and not just accept it on face value. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, I have to leave because I have another commitment, but please go ahead and have some discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amanda.
Thank
you. Dr. Swarna, do you have any additions, or I'll leave the floor to, would love to hear from the attendees, from those who attended. We have a quite attendance today. Thank you so much for being here. So any comments are welcome, or any questions are most welcome.
No, I just will say, while we're waiting for people to tap up their questions, that it was a really astounding presentation. I mean, I'm listening to this. I wear two hats. I'm a political scientist, but like you, I also have an activist life, and my organization does work raising awareness around a lot of the same issues. And I'm always struck by how different the debates are, and yet how similar the underlying patriarchies are everywhere. For us, at this point, we're still not really debating abortion or contraception, because I think the shadow of the old population control approach is still with us. And we haven't begun to think of abortion as some sort of insult to patriarchy as yet. But what is similar, I think, is the conservatizing drive that is both in mainstream politics and then also in any discourses around gender. And I'm also interested in this parallel that you draw between international funding, which we saw here with the amount of money that came in with the Gates Foundation for HIV/AIDS work, and then it sort of spread to other kinds of gender and reproductive justice work, but is pulling back now, because so if they won't pay for it, nobody will pay for it. So what happens? And I'm just curious. I mean, the kind of awareness work we do is ends up being at such a basic level, because we work with community essentially saying, don't you think this is an issue? But I'm listening to you and thinking how complex these issues are, and do we really think enough of them? So it's more of a comment and an observation, and just say it was an absolutely awesome presentation. And I'm sure it was a fantastic dissertation that we will read bits and pieces of over the years. So thank you so much for being a part of this.
Okay. We have,
thank you.
We have Mr. Anush Kumar. Please, the floor is yours. Maybe the host can unmute him, or you can unmute yourself.
Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
So my name is Anush Kumar, second year student at Sai University. So
we can hear you,
thank
but
you for
you're
Swarna
not
today
clear.
afternoon. So yeah, the question gone through.
We can hear you, but
Am
you're
I-
not clear. You may be better typing your question.
Sure.
we can't hear you, Mr. Anush, properly. Okay, can you give it another try? Or you can type your question in the chat.
Am I audible right now? Am I audible right now? Yes, so the question I wanted to know that HIV/AIDS is something the world is suffering through, and we don't have a solid treatment for that. And we still, I mean, as we saw in the, as we have seen in the presentation, that we still lack fund for that. And if I, being an international student, I have seen that it is one of the important UK agenda for, and a lot of candidates in section this time, they have I mean, they have something to say about this thing. So why do we still, despite knowing that it is something to be addressed at the earliest, because people are suffering every now and then. So looking at the suffering so due to HIV/AIDS, why can't we allocate more funds to it, especially to poor countries, like to African countries where it is on peak, like Nigeria and all, and even South Africa. So that's my question.
Maybe Marion, is the question clear?
So Anuj, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you. So let me just repeat your question so that I heard you saying that there's a burden of HIV and that we're not devoting enough attention and funds to HIV. So I see some of my colleagues are raising their hands who probably work in this area as well. But certainly I believe that there's been enormous investment in HIV prevention and in HIV treatment. So perverse that in South Africa, men who are HIV positive live longer than men that are not HIV positive because they seek care and they are in treatment. So I believe that there are extraordinary donor programs that are doing HIV treatment. We now have access to PrEP, I believe, in the region. In Kenya, I believe we started the first PrEP this past week, injectable PrEP. So you only have to take the injection every 6 months. So Anush, I think I would kind of disagree with you and say that we shouldn't be separating out all these issues. HIV is not separate from sexual and reproductive health. It's one of the health dilemmas or areas that needs treatment, just like other bodies of work. And certainly in South Africa, we're starting to see a rise of other STIs, sexually transmitted infections, separate from HIV, because we've run out of treatment for syphilis. So let me leave that to Stu, and I see that my colleagues have got other questions that they'd like to raise.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you, Anush, for your remarks and questions. I'm going to give the floor to Karen, and after that, Daphne, and then Zena. Please, Karen, the floor is yours, please.
Hi, I'm just going to look that way, but I'm actually, my camera's there. You guys are there. So Marion, something that occurred to me while you were speaking, and that when you spoke about the fact that policy, you know, that we need to interrogate policy, and then looking at women being blamed for climate change. And it occurred to me one of the things that has been said about Palestine, and which is almost, which is horrifically excusing genocide, is when people say, well, you know, so many people have been cleared, that there's been this ethnic cleansing, and then the response I've seen has been, but look at the population size. And I mean, I don't know, that's not necessarily a question, but it's what your presentation has reminded me of, is how policy is used against people. And in this sense, it was almost, I'm saying almost because I don't want to say it was, but it was this justification for genocide was like, well, okay, so the Nakba happened, but look at the population size, and essentially that Muslim women are having so many children anyway. And yeah, it's not a question, but I think that your work, it touches on a lot more than what I had thought, and it was very moving. So thank you.
Thanks, Karen. And I think, you know, I could go on. There's an extraordinary clip by Professor Roz Pachetsky, a political science and one of the leading kind of actors in Jews for Peace in New York, who talks about what's happening in Palestine as reproductive injustice and how that is a contributor to genocide. And certainly, it's quite clear that there are enormous efforts to control populations. And we've seen that, I didn't touch that, but it's well known that Black Jews, Ethiopian Jews in Israel have been forcibly given Depo-Provera, and that's been well documented over time. So there's a real kind of white supremacy, genocide, population control program on the part of Israel. There's no doubt on that. Thank you, Yasmin.
Thank you, Karen, for your remarks. I'm gonna move to Miss Daphne. Daphne, please.
Doctor.
Hi. Mine is just to congratulate my colleague and friend from back in the day. But yeah, well done, Marion, for being consistent and staying on this path. That was difficult, and at some stage, some of us just disengaged because we were feeling defeated. So this analysis that you have made of all the complexities is really like painting a picture. And what I like more about your study or your work is how it also contributes in a written form, because you keep on telling people that no, we were active back in the day, we've contributed to this policy. These policies didn't just get there. So when you bring it in, it's kind of like reminding people that because it does feel like you older people, what were you doing all these years? So you are painting a picture that we did a lot. It may not look like that because of all the complexities and all the things that you've described. All our efforts are in the paper, but not in the lives of women, which is quite sad. But so I want to come back to you. Your mind has been working on this all the time. So for our generation, moving forward, what do you think we can still contribute in a meaningful way moving forward? Because we are sitting in our corners, just wanting to do something, but I think there's still something. So what do you think we could do moving forward as this collective, but reaching to the younger generation, but with all the kind of experience and and wisdom from our failures, maybe? So that's my question as a way forward, please.
Thank you, Dr. Daphne.
Thank you, Dr. Daphne. Thank you. I think these are painful and important conversations to have about intergenerational sharing of lessons and histories, with a hope that we could not make the same mistakes, and to inspire people to read about what happened, what the organizing we did in the 90s, how extraordinary it was, what it birthed. But it's a different period now. And so what can one take with us? And what do we leave behind? I think that some of the pertinent changes are, social media and the very fast-paced style, the rise of kind of influencer, astroturf culture, So how do we deal with that very quick, apparent, superficial communication, which has traction? And the other reality is that we have got some treatment options. So with HIV, we are managing our treatment. With abortion, we've got medical abortion now. We've even got options in the region where we've got sex worker distributed, self-managed abortion. So the kinds of old treatment barriers around abortion access we've kind of leapfrogged that, but at the same time, we've got this terrible reality where all of our public sectors have been eviscerated and carved out, and we now have a context where we have to work with donors, where there's essentially we've got, you know, international stakeholders in our rooms, whether we like it or not, and how do we manage that? And I think these are the kinds of things that we need to talk about and learn and explore. How do we crawl back or cleave back some level of autonomy and independence? But yeah, I think it would be great to think and talk about this more. Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you, Dr. Daphne, for your...
That's information. We are not using the chat because it's disabled. The chat, we're not able to use it because it's disabled. Just for your information. Thank you. Thank
you, Dr.
Thank
Daphne.
you.
Then Dr. Zena, please. Musutu. Dr. Zena.
Hi, everyone. I'm not a doctor yet, hopefully soon.
To be soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marion, for your presentation. Just a bit of background about me. I'm currently doing my master's at UCT, and my research is definitely like within the sexual and reproductive health space. I will be looking into queer people who are living with STIs, and just how they relate to the world, etc. To cut a long story short, I think something that also really jumped out to me that I hadn't taken or considered deeply was just how deeply linked population populationism is within the sexual and reproductive health space. And I think this was a really nice reminder. I'm not sure that I have many questions, but I have a few comments just generally, and then I'll close it off. Firstly, I remember last year I was working as a research assistant, and I was interviewing different government officials and NPO workers. And I raised this issue, okay, to be fair, it is with the Department of Basic Education, but I raised this issue of the reliance of international donors in our spaces, and how obviously global gag rules will influence the services that people are allowed to receive. And it was really nice in some ways to hear even the official being he sees it as some type of colonization or recolonization, but the overall attitude with regards to international funding, even if it may somewhat be in contradiction with our own constitution and laws, was that it provides some type of greater good, especially because I think the government uses international funding or external funding as some sort of relaxant so that they wouldn't have to invest and reinvest in their own public services. It's actually extremely worrying. I didn't know how much the government invests in private institutions like Mary Stoves. And my friends and I, because I'm 23, my friends and I would joke, Kiki, Mary Stopes, that's an option. I just didn't realize that it's also being made to be an option because of the shocking stat of 7% of our services not even working. And then I remember, I hope you can still hear me. I remember trying to access termination of pregnancy services here in Cape Town, and I was sent to 3 different clinics within the space of a week, not necessarily because they didn't do termination of pregnancy, but more because the person wasn't there, and or they didn't want to, it was too late, and or she was the only person working that day. And a lot of, as it happens in the public healthcare sector, a lot of disdain, maybe disdain is a strong word, a lot of just uncaring and lack of compassion to individuals when they are experiencing whatever's that they're experiencing. So I just also wanted it to like, yeah, that is like the current reflection in 2023, 2024 of the state of sexual and reproductive health services in the country. And I know that there's, I think the Bekisisa app, which would show across the country the different spaces that offer termination of pregnancy. But it's scary that even if we look at that map and it may not be updated, you might still go to 3 different clinics just to access that stuff. Then lastly, I was thinking about, okay, so more clarity on my research. I'm specifically focusing on STIs that are not HIV, while acknowledging like the amount of important research that has been done in HIV, on HIV. I think there are a lot of blind spots that become created by the overt focus in HIV. And I think especially with the more long-term like STIs like HSV and HPV. So I was just wondering, like, where in our sexual and reproductive health landscape is there space for like longer term care and living for people who have these diseases and still are individuals who want to live full lives and full sexual lives as well? Like, what are the spaces do you think that need to be focused on more, and or yeah, like I just want to hear around that. I think I don't know how to form my question properly, but I just wanted to hear around that. Thank you.
Thanks, Zena. What department are you doing your master's in?
I'm doing it in the African Feminist Studies department. We used to be the Gender Studies department, but yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm really glad that you're doing this work because I think it's a huge gap and I think it's a neglected area. I mentioned that you know, there's been an overbearing focus on HIV and there's been a neglect of other STIs, like I mentioned, syphilis, which is a huge burden and causes enormous illness and discomfort. There's been global stockouts of what's a pen B, benzyl, whatever. The other STI that you mentioned is, you know, the HPV vaccinations have been around, but what is quite to address cervical cancer. But what I think is an important point to note is the HPV vaccination that's available in the public sector does not cover the range of HPV options, you know, so it doesn't cover warts, genital warts. So I think that's a huge issue for people, and you're starting to see people, I know from clinicians, that people will not be getting cervical cancer, but there'll be there's still a huge epidemic of people with genital warts that are coming in, which is a real kind of disability in a sense. So I think that's really opportune to do some advocacy and work around this area. I hope that you're working with queer groups like Triangle, their health services, Carol and Vanessa, Carol and Sharon, I think. I think that we also need to perhaps go back to basics in terms of some of our work around sexual health. And I know that we developed within the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition a critique of the very punitive and judgmental kind of comprehensive sexuality education messaging that is not affirming, you know, disease, danger, blame, and is not really looking at creative ways of having safer sex options to address STIs for people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. So all the best for your work, and thank you.
Thank you. We have only 2 more minutes left, so maybe we can give the floor to Simone, and then we can wrap up. 2 or 3 more minutes left.
Thank you. I'll try to be very quick. I'll just echo what everyone else has said. Really well done, Marion. It's so amazing to have such a comprehensive documentation of everything. So yes, I will move from that. And I think it's also what has come up from the other questions that have been asked, but just also as someone who's balancing the advocacy hat and the research hat, where do we go from here? What are your recommendations of the gaps in evidence that are needed for advocacy, or what advocacy needs to happen, or yeah, where are the real pain points moving forward that people in those positions can put efforts towards?
Thank you, Simone. Dr. Marion, maybe.
So maybe just to say thank you, Simone, that I'd really encourage people to organize and get involved with groups like the Sexual and Reproductive Justice Coalition. I've just been invited to a policy process to develop a sexual and reproductive justice strategy for South Africa, and there's very few people that are engaged, and I'm disturbed that it's so few. So I would really encourage people to the questions and the answers that are needed need to be determined by a collective, and I think that's where one needs to go back to organizing and to people and to women and to ask them what the issues are, and to then move from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you again, Dr. Marion, for this very valuable, informative presentation. And thank you for, those who attended the webinar and made it such a successful event. Our next webinar will take place next month, exactly on the 20th of March. So we would love your attendance, and we look forward to receiving your pitches and share your research about issues, topics related to women in politics in all spheres. Thank you all, and great to have you all. Thank you.